Beginning in on Descartes now, on the meditations, we're going to do three things. First, I'm going to give you a kind of brief biography of Descartes, who he was, what he did, that kind of thing, very brief. Then we're going to talk about the intellectual context, that he was writing in, but also which preceded him. One of the things that I hope to show, illustrate for you, is the fact that we can't really make sense of the meditations unless we understand that intellectual background. So we'll spend some time doing that. And what that will also kind of do for us is fill in this huge hole between Aristotle and Descartes. Descartes writing in this 1600s, Aristotle wrote in the 300 BCs. There's a lot of time there. We'll say something very brief about that. And then the third thing that we'll do after kind of laying out that intellectual background, that intellectual context, we'll jump into the meditations and we'll talk about what exactly he's doing in this first meditation, what the skeptical hypotheses that he discusses are, how they work, what he's trying to do with them. All right, so a brief word about Descartes. There he is. Looking pretty good. Born in 1596, died in 1650. Says it right there. He was born in France. He came from a family of lawyers, and he had studied law himself. So his family wasn't particularly wealthy, but they weren't poorly off either. And they gave Descartes, made sure he received a first-rate education. And at that time, still true today, it was with the Jesuits. So he went and studied at a school called La Flèche in France, studied with the Jesuits. We'll come back to this later. He's a highly educated guy. He becomes very interested in science and mathematics while he's studying with the Jesuits, and this interest continues on later into life. His works really encompass three different subject areas as listed here. He was a scientist, a mathematician, and a philosopher. And early on, in his early writing career, he was more interested in science. He wrote a lot about optics, about the weather, about how the human body worked, about that's what the treatise of man is concerned with. It's not an ethical treatise or anything like that. It's about he had a view about how it is muscles and whatever move bones and things like that. That's what that was about. And he also wrote on astronomy, and that's what the book The World is about. So he was very much interested in science. We also find him writing on mathematics, and this is probably what he's most well known for, maybe his most important contribution to human learning. So this work he wrote called The Geometry. Descartes, you may have heard the name before, or it might sound kind of familiar. He was the first guy to come up with what is now called the Cartesian coordinate plane, which you see right there. This idea that we can map functions. So for example, what I have up there, that you can map algebraic functions into a geometrical space. That was Descartes' idea. He was the first person to do that. And of course, mathematics as we know it wouldn't be anywhere without, well, it's maybe an overstatement, but it'd be much less far along without that novel development that Descartes is responsible for. So the Cartesian coordinate system is named after Descartes. But then what we find later in his writing career, if you will, he turns his attention to philosophical subjects. And what we're going to be interested in, of course, are his philosophical writings. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on what's called the Meditations on First Philosophy. This is Descartes' most widely read, perhaps most important work. And we're going to kind of go through the main, most important ideas from that work, trying to understand what's going on with them. All right. So the first line of the Meditations, he says, "Some years ago I was struck by how many false things I had believed and by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs that I had based on them." Now, I'm mentioning this first line here because without understanding the intellectual background against which Descartes is writing, we can't really understand what that first line means. And that first line opens up the rest of the project. It's because he thinks this is true that he then goes on to do everything else that he does in the Meditations. And so I'm going to put this first line here. I'm going to tell you, and hopefully you can take my word for it, this is kind of no idle claim. When he says, "I was struck by how many false things I believed," he really means that. He means that most of what he had believed, he came to later think was false. And so almost everything he thought about the world, he comes to later think is false. And so the Meditations is supposed to take up from this, it's supposed to be begin from this recognition that most of what Descartes had thought was false. Well, why would you think that? Why did he think that? That's what we're going to try to understand by understanding the intellectual background a bit more. All right, so what was that intellectual background? How are we going to make sense of this claim? Here we have a timeline. We've read Plato, we've read Aristotle. There is a whole bunch of time between Aristotle and now Descartes, who we're reading. What's going on? Are we just jumping and there's nothing important that's happening here? Well, of course, there were lots of important things going on here, but there's a few things that I want to point out very quickly. So, kind of developments in philosophy. What happens? Very, very quick and general overview. After Aristotle, Greek philosophy continues to thrive. So after Aristotle's death, Aristotle has his own school, which is kind of taken up. You have there are followers of Aristotle. They're called Peripatetics. But this is really the period of what is called Hellenistic philosophy. And Aristotle's school is kind of peripheral. It doesn't really produce much. Instead, when people study this period of philosophy, they tend to study one of these or all three of the following schools: Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. We're not going to talk about the details of these schools at all. One thing I want to say about them, however, is that they're very much influenced, all three of them very much influenced in their own ways by Plato and Aristotle, by that view of the world. They're kind of taking up from where Plato or Aristotle left off, and developing thoughts in different ways, disagreeing with some of what they said, but developing other things. With the kind of diminishing of Hellenistic philosophy, what people refer to as Neoplatonism comes to be the reigning philosophical paradigm. The chief Neoplatonist is a guy named Plotinus. Neoplatonism is probably better known today because Saint Augustine, who was a Christian theologian and philosopher, was not necessarily himself a Neoplatonist, but he was very much influenced by them and read them and knew about them. And so we have Augustine, who you may have read in theology classes or in other classes. He's living during this time too. Neoplatonism, as you might imagine, just given the name, it too is very much influenced by Plato. Also Aristotle is called Neoplatonism, but they also, they thought Aristotle was basically a Platonist. And so they were equally influenced by Aristotle and Plato. And so the legacy of Aristotle and Plato kind of lives on through Neoplatonism. Rome falls sometime around 500. I don't know. Historians debate about when exactly that happens. It's not clear that there's a definitive date. But at that point, So the kind of potted history of Europe, at least, goes. We enter the Dark Ages, and there isn't much in the way of science or philosophy or learning or whatever going on in Europe starting around 500. And that's an oversimplification, but there's some truth to it. Fine. Instead, what happens is the kind of cutting edge of learning of science, math, philosophy, theology. It's transferred to the Arab world, uh, and beginning around, I don't know, 750, 800 or so, we have what people call the Islamic Golden Age. There's a series of there are a number of philosophers, theologians, mathematicians, scientists in the Islamic world who kind of carry on, if you will, the torch lit by Plato and Aristotle, developing science, developing learning, developing philosophy in new and novel ways. And I've listed some of these figures. They're not household names, but they're very, very important for the history of philosophy and for the history of thought more generally. So there's Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Averroes. There are other ones too. I've listed the ones that were most important for philosophy, since that's kind of what I know about. But for instance, there were mathematicians too. There were very important mathematical breakthroughs made in the Arab world during this time. For example, algebra, that's an Arabic word. It was discovered during this time, during the Islamic Golden Age. Now, all of these figures, Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Averroes, they too are very much influenced by Aristotle in particular, but also Plato. I'd mentioned just a minute ago how they were picking up the torch from Aristotle and Plato. That is very much true. Averroes, for instance, most of his work, a lot of his work, consisted in commentaries on Aristotle. He would have the works of Aristotle and kind of write interpretations of them, or try to tell the reader what exactly Aristotle was getting at, since that's not always obvious, is it? Those commentaries, the work of these Islamic philosophers and theologians and mathematicians and scientists, it eventually, through the Crusades actually, but it eventually finds its way back into the European world and gives rise to what people refer to now as scholasticism or medieval scholasticism. So the kind of standard potted history of European intellectual culture would say something like, well, yeah, you had Aristotle and Plato, Hellenistic philosophy, Neoplatonism, philosophy was thriving, learning was thriving. Then you have this Dark Ages from, I don't know, 500 to 1000, 500 to 1100. And then the lights are turned back on, inspired by these Islamic texts, these Islamic philosophers. And we have this flourishing of theology, science, philosophy, and so on within the medieval world. That's scholasticism. And so some of the central figures here are Saint Anselm. He had a very famous argument that Descartes actually minds in the Meditations. We're not reading it. It's called the ontological argument. The most well-known scholastic philosopher, however, was St. Thomas Aquinas, the guy that we were going to read, but unfortunately we didn't have time to. He was very, very much interested in Aristotle and very much an Aristotelian. What we were going to read by Aquinas was his development of Aristotle's arguments for the existence of God. During Aquinas's time, so 500 to 1000, say roughly, in that, so prior to Aquinas, the texts of Aristotle had been lost in Europe. They were reintroduced through these Islamic philosophers, through bringing these, in particular, bringing Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle back into, or bringing them into Europe for the first time. And so Aristotle, through people like Averroes, through these Islamic philosophers, is reintroduced to European thinkers. That's the context in which Aquinas is writing, and what Aquinas tries to argue is something like, or what he tries to demonstrate, tries to show, is that Aristotle actually gives a solid intellectual backdrop or grounding for a particularly theistic, particularly Christian view of the world. And so Aquinas tries to make use of Aristotle in these ways. Now, the upshot of this history, so this is very roughly, I mean, there's a lot of things that I mentioned, obviously. The more goes on in these, 1800 years or so than I could possibly mention here and now. What I want to emphasize, and what's going to be important for us, and what I've been emphasizing along the way, is that all of these different schools, all of these different philosophers are heavily indebted to Aristotle in particular, also Plato, but Plato and Aristotle kind of go together. They all, in very, very general terms, have an Aristotelian view of philosophy, or view of the world more generally. They all are indebted to and are building upon Aristotle. All of these people, the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, Averroes, the Scholastics. Aristotle sets the intellectual paradigm for the next 1800 years. That's the paradigm in which all of these people are doing their work. That's the paradigm in which any kind of learning, any kind of knowledge operated in. Okay. Now, what I want to do is say a little bit more about what exactly that paradigm was, what exactly that view of the world was, this Aristotelian view of the world that reigned supreme for these 1800 years. I want to highlight one aspect of it. And so I call it part of Aristotle's legacy, because it's not the only thing that Aristotle kind of bequeathed to people, if you will. But it's a teleological view of the world. That's part of Aristotle's legacy, a teleological view of the world. Well, what on earth does that mean? That's a made-up word. That doesn't make any sense. Teleological, or teleology, it is a made-up word. I suppose all words are made up, but it comes from the Greek word telos. And even, I'm not sure that I've mentioned this in class, but we've been in our, when we were going over Aristotle, we were going over this idea. We were going over his teleological conception of the world, even though we weren't using that word. The Greek word telos means something like end or goal or purpose. When we talked about the final cause, Aristotle's four causes, the final cause, that for the sake of which, that's the end or goal or purpose of a thing. The final cause of a thing is its telos. Now, what does it mean to say that Aristotle had a teleological view of the world, and that all these philosophers and thinkers who followed Aristotle had a teleological view of the world? It means that they thought, Aristotle thought, I'll just talk about Aristotle, all the other guys thought this too, but it means that Aristotle thought that just about everything in the world could be explained in terms of its final cause, in terms of its telos. Everything had a final cause, and really the best, or primary, Aristotle would say, primary explanation of a thing is going to cite its final cause, its telos. Everything has a teleological explanation. Everything in the world is teleologically ordered. Everything has an end or a goal or purpose that it is kind of geared toward, right? And we've seen this idea repeatedly when we've been talking about Aristotle. Now, when we were talking about Aristotle, the main thing we were looking at were things like frogs. That was my main example, right? You have a tadpole. Its telos, we can now say, its final cause is to be a mature adult frog. It's kind of ordered toward that maturity, ordered toward realizing the form. That's that for the sake of which, according to Aristotle, right? So we've been looking at natural things, and we've talked about it in terms of human beings as well, but living things in particular, right? We've been looking at living organisms, the telos of a living organism, the end goal purpose of a living organism. Okay, fine. So things, those kinds of things, living organisms can be analyzed or explained in terms of their telos. That's part of what it means to say that these people, Aristotle, had a teleological view of the world. But Aristotle thought, and these other people following Aristotle thought, that it wasn't just natural living organisms that had teleological explanations, that had a telos, but also the very material, basic material stuff out of which sensible reality is made. Those things all had a telos too. If you recall, when we were covering the physics in Aristotle, I said kind of tangentially in class, yeah, Aristotle, there's a group of things that have a nature, according to Aristotle. To have a nature is to have an internal principle of movement, of change or rest. That's Aristotle's idea. You have that group of things, the group of things that have a nature. A subclass of that are living things. What that implies, however, is that there's a class of natural things, and so things that have an internal principle of motion and rest, that aren't alive. And Aristotle would say, yes, that's exactly right. And what those things are the four elements: earth, fire, air, and water. Those things, earth, fire, air, and water, all have a telos too. They all have a purpose or goal or end. There's a final cause, so to speak, for those things as well. And so now the puzzle is, and this idea, the idea that earth, fire, air, and water have a telos, a purpose, gives rise to what people call the doctrine of natural place. Aristotle never calls it that, but when people talk about this, they refer to it as that. Okay, so what is the idea here? Take Earth. What Aristotle means by Earth is not the planet. He means like dirt, the stuff, Earth. And in Aristotle's view, Aristotle wouldn't say that, well, put it this way. His view was that all the things that we interact with in the sensible world, so a sheet of paper or a glove or keys or whatever, or your body, your hand, things like this, blood, all those things are composed out of certain combinations of earth, fire, air, and water. And so blood, for example, would be, according to Aristotle, a particular ratio, which would be predominantly water. Maybe second place would be fire. Maybe there's a little bit of air. Maybe there's a little bit of earth because it's kind of viscous. I don't know exactly what they thought. But a very particular ratio of those four elements just is what blood is. And same would go for wood, right? So wood would have a different ratio because whatever, it's got different properties. Okay, fine. So everything's kind of composed of those four things. Well, that just raises the question then, if those things have a telos or purpose, what on earth is that telos or purpose? What is the purpose of earth, of that stuff? And Aristotle's answer, and this is when we're kind of getting into this doctrine of natural place now. His idea is that the telos or purpose of earth, well, what does it do? I don't know, it just kind of sits there. Well, he'd say something like this. Let's say I lifted up some earth and then let it go. What would it do? It would fall. Well, what is it to fall? It's to, this isn't exactly how we describe it, but it's to go below the air, right? If I had earth up here, right in my hand, and it's above all this air, and I let it go, it's going to go below that air. Now, let's say I also had a bucket of water here, right? So it's above the air and above the bucket of water, right? If you had an instructor who's actually good at this online stuff, they would have brought in the props for it. Well, I let the earth go. It goes below the air, and then it hits the water. It goes below the water. And get fire in there. I don't know. You light a fire and you hold some, I don't know. The fire is going to go up. It's going to go up above the earth. It's going to go up above everything else. The telos, or goal, or purpose, or final cause of earth, according to Aristotle, is to be below fire, air, and water. It's to be below everything else. The telos of water is to be above earth and below the air and fire. The telos of air is to be above earth and water and below the fire. And then fire, right? You light a fire or whatever, it shoots up. It's trying to get up above the air. And that was Aristotle's view. He thought there was kind of, I don't know, there's fire out there at the outer edge of the air, and it kind of mixed with the air. I don't know, it gets kind of confusing. But that's the doctrine of natural place. These four elements have a natural place that they naturally seek. Air naturally seeks to be above earth and water. Earth naturally seeks to be below the other three elements. So obviously, Aristotle and the people following, they didn't know about gravity yet. That wasn't until Newton that we got the idea of gravity, and so they wouldn't explain Earth's falling or whatever, right? I drop a pen. They wouldn't explain that in terms of gravity. They would explain that in terms of the fact that the pen is composed mostly of earth, and so it falls, right? It goes below the air because it's mostly earth. Okay. That's the doctrine of natural place. And so that seems to follow, or this was the idea at least, seems to follow rather straightforwardly from this teleological view of the world. It's part and parcel of this teleological view of this world, of the world, the doctrine of natural place, right? Okay. Well, it didn't take long. I mean, Aristotle himself realized this, that one important implication of the doctrine of natural place is going to be astronomical, if you will, not in the sense of, fantastic, but in the sense of relating to astronomy. The doctrine of natural place has implications for astronomy, and in particular, what it implies is geocentrism, that the Earth is going to be at the center of the universe or solar system, with everything else revolving around it. Right? So here's a picture I found on the internet, which attempts to illustrate this Aristotelian view of the world. So you get Earth at the very center of everything with water. There's a thin blue layer. They don't label it. But water around the Earth, and then air around that. And then the fire, right? It's seeking its natural place above the air. And so it's kind of out there. And then Aristotle had this idea that the sun, the moon, the planets, and then the stars, they're all made out of this fifth kind of element called ether, or whatever. We're not going to worry about it. It's weight. Don't worry about it. But a geocentric view of the world, geocentric view of the universe, a view of the universe according to which Earth is at the middle, and the sun, the planets, and stars all revolve around it. Geocentrism seemed to follow very naturally from the doctrine of natural place, which was just a part of this teleological view or conception of the world. This was part of Aristotle's legacy. And so all of those thinkers and philosophers, or at least most of them, not all of them, but most of those thinkers, scientists, philosophers who we'd seen in that kind of intervening period between Aristotle and Descartes, right? The Hellenistic, we'll see him in a second again. The Hellenistic philosophers, the Neoplatonists, and so on, they would have had this same view of the world. This would have been part of their inheritance that they received from Aristotle, right? So Aristotle's teleological view of the world, with this doctrine of natural place and geocentrism, would have been part of this view of the world that all of these thinkers and scientists were had accepted. It's part of the view of the world they all accepted. All right. So there we are again, right? So all those people up on the board would have accepted this Aristotelian view of the world. Okay, doctrine of natural place, geocentrism, all of it. Well, now we're kind of up to Descartes. We're getting close to his time, right? With the end of medieval scholasticism. That goes until the 1500s at some point. Well, Descartes was born at the very end of the 1500s. What else is going on? Well, no, not that way. We start getting in the 1500s criticisms of the geocentric model of the universe. So Nicholas Copernicus publishes his main work on astronomy. It's published, I believe, just posthumously. He dies in 1543, and it's published in 1543. So middle of the 1500s, Copernicus very famously argues for, advocates not a geocentric view of the universe, but a heliocentric one. Heliocentric, with the sun at the middle and the earth revolving around the sun. And in very short order, this view of the universe starts finding adherents, defenders, right? So Kepler shortly after Copernicus, and then Galileo shortly, or contemporaneous really, with Kepler. These developments are referred to as the scientific revolution, right? You have all these thinkers arguing for a heliocentric view of the universe, and doing so in many cases with, so Galileo very famously was able to engage in certain observations of the moons of Jupiter, maybe, I can't remember which planet it was exactly, but using a telescope. So I had access to information, to data that, Islamic astronomers simply didn't have. And it's on the basis of that kind of information and data that these thinkers start attacking the geocentric view of the universe, of the solar system. Well, okay, that's all fine and good, and you probably remember something of this from, I don't know, a science or history class you took at some point. But now, having read Aristotle, having understood a bit about this Aristotelian view of the world, we can see more clearly, I think, or more fully, what the stakes are. Because it's not just that Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus were rejecting geocentrism, although they were certainly doing that. But geocentrism, as we just saw, was bound up with this doctrine of natural place. And so in rejecting geocentrism, you were also rejecting this doctrine of natural place. But this doctrine of natural place was just part of this teleological view of the world. And so in rejecting geocentrism and the doctrine of natural place, you were also rejecting, or these people took themselves to be rejecting, a teleological view of the world. And so the scientific revolution, or at least the proponents of it, understood themselves, not all of them, but a lot of them, understood themselves as attacking an Aristotelian view of the world. They were parting company with Aristotle. They saw Aristotle as putting forward this teleological view of the world, which implied geocentrism, and they saw that geocentrism was false. And so Aristotle, his view of the world, had to be false. Someone like Galileo is explicit about this. Francis Bacon, who I don't have up there on the timeline, but he wrote about methodology in science during this time, was a proponent, one of these people writing during the scientific revolution. And he made it explicit. The new science explicitly rejects final causality or explaining things in terms of a telos or purpose. That's part of what it is to be a proponent of the new science. That's the intellectual environment which Descartes found himself in, right? He's right in the middle of all of this. He's contemporaries with Kepler and Galileo. He knew about Galileo, right? As we saw earlier, he'd written a bunch about science right during this period, right in the middle of the scientific revolution. So he was well aware of the developments in science going on. And he was well aware that people like Galileo and Francis Bacon and so on were arguing that the new science was incompatible with an Aristotelian view of the world. And so really what's at stake in the scientific revolution is not just geocentrism or versus heliocentrism. It's an entire way of viewing and understanding the world. And the entire way of viewing and understanding the world that had reigned supreme for about 1800 years or so was being rejected. Right, so it's not just some little change we're making. Oh, okay, fine, whatever. The Earth goes around the sun. Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's a totally different way of viewing things. That, at least, is how the proponents of the scientific revolution understood it. Okay, so it's a rejection of geocentrism, but also of Aristotle. Right, that's the important point. Now, turn back to this first line from the Meditations. Descartes, as I briefly touched upon in the biography of him, was educated at a place called La Flèche. He was educated by the Jesuits. We know a bit about what that education would have looked like. It would have been an education into the Aristotelian view of the world, the scholastic Aristotelian view of the world. He would have been exposed to these ideas of final causality, of the doctrine of natural place, and so on, and geocentrism. That would have been how he was educated. That would have been the paradigm into which he was educated. Being interested in science, right? That wasn't all he was exposed to. He was, as you can probably imagine, right? He was a pretty intelligent person. He was a man of letters. He went around reading the kind of discussing science, philosophy with the most advanced scientists and philosophers, mathematicians of the day. And so when he says this line at the very beginning of the meditation, some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed. He means that. What he's referring to there is that Aristotelian view of the world into which he was educated. And some years ago, when he started reading Copernicus or Kepler or whoever it might have been, right, he realized that this entire view of the world, this Aristotelian view of the world, was just riddled with problems. So much of it was false, right? That's the problem. That's what he's referring to in this very first sentence. And because this Aristotelian view of the world, according to Descartes and these other proponents of the scientific revolution, because it had so many false things built into it, how could you really trust any of it? I mean, maybe they were saying some things that were true and right or whatever. Maybe it wasn't all false, but I don't know. That whole structure of beliefs, is what Descartes is saying here, was rendered doubtful by the discovery that heliocentrism is true, for instance. And so in someone like, according to Descartes, we needed to, all previous science, basically, Aristotelian science, was on very shaky footing. Looks like it needs to, right? The structure of beliefs of Aristotelian science was very, very doubtful. Now, as a scientist, he's very interested in how bodies work, what the structure of the universe is, and so on, how physics works. And so what he's going to do in the meditations is try to provide a new paradigm, a new intellectual framework for science. So how is this going to go? I realized, so here's a quotation from Descartes, I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, right? So this, again, is a reference to Aristotelian science, this Aristotelian view of the world. It was not stable and likely to last. It totally crumbled. We had to reject the whole thing. The whole view of the world was riddled with problems. If we want to avoid that, which Descartes as a scientist, person interested in science, absolutely wants to avoid. If we want to avoid that, well, I needed just once in my life to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. We need to totally get rid of this Aristotelian view of the world and start over. And this is in certain ways a kind of tragedy for Descartes. That, what does this mean? It means the past 1800 years of scientific inquiry kind of in vain. No real point or purpose to it. We need to discard it all and start over, right? 1800 years of lost research, of vain efforts, right? We want to avoid that ever happening again. If we want to get to the truth about things and really understand how the world works and so on, we got to make sure that we don't start off with such doubtful foundations. And so Descartes, in the Meditations, is going to first try to demolish everything completely. That's what he does in the first meditation. And we'll talk about what that means in a second, but then try to rebuild the structure of knowledge, right? So he uses these architectural metaphors throughout the meditations. So we had this kind of structure of knowledge, this structure of learning that was Aristotelianism, but we came to see that this brick was bad and that brick was bad and that, whatever, I don't know, 2x4 was rotten or whatever. At a certain point, the house becomes so dilapidated that you need to just raise it and begin again from fresh foundations. That's Descartes' idea. The Aristotelian house or structure or whatever is so run down, so dilapidated. Bulldoze it, start over. Well, how are we going to start over? That's a kind of problem. What do we start with? What kind of foundation should we start with? Well, Descartes again is pretty clear. He says something like the following, and the second quotation you have there. My reason tells me that as well as withholding assent from propositions that are obviously false, right? So you don't believe things that are obviously false. You don't believe that 2 + 2 = 5, right? Your reason tells you not to assent to that. Don't believe it. Okay, fine. I should also withhold it from ones that are not completely certain and indubitable, right? So indubitable means unable to doubt. So a proposition is indubitable if you couldn't possibly doubt it, right? And so what he's saying here is that, well, what I need to do, so yeah, not believe false things. Okay, fine. That's a good first step. You should always be doing that. But what we should really do is look for things that are completely certain, things that can't possibly be doubted, things that couldn't possibly be false. Those will make the surest, best foundations, right? Because if something couldn't possibly be doubted, couldn't possibly be false, and then we make that our foundation, well, there's no way that that foundation would ever crumble. It's totally certain. It's impossible for it to be false. That's the kind of foundation we want for all of human knowledge and learning and science and understanding going forward. And what he's saying here is that the problem, or at least one of the many problems with the Aristotelian paradigm, with the Aristotelian view of the world, was that its foundations were not completely certain. And then what ended up happening is that some of those foundations turned out to be false. They were not true. And so the building crumbles, right? The edifice of knowledge doesn't hold together. Something like that is Descartes' idea. And so what he's going to do in the meditations, in meditation 1, he's going to demolish everything, raise the ground, get rid of everything, call everything into doubt that could possibly be doubted. And then in the subsequent meditations, that's the project of building back up, right? So meditations 1, we're going to raise the structure to the ground, get everything out of the way that's not certain and indubitable. And then in the subsequent meditations, we're going to start building back up from a foundation that is certain and indubitable. Now, so what Descartes is going to do is he's going to give, he's going to want to call into doubt everything that can be doubted. If something can be doubted, that's a sign that it's not totally certain, right? Something is certain if it's indubitable, if it can't be doubted. If it can be doubted, it's not certain. It might be true, but it's not certain. And what we want for the new science as our foundations are things that could not possibly be false, things that are absolutely certain, things that are indubitable. And so Descartes' basic move is going to be to try to call into doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. And then all that will be left are things that are absolutely certain. And we'll start with that, right? That's the building back up project. We'll just start with these absolutely certain things. But what he says is, well, look, I can't just, I could go through my beliefs one by one and that, is this a pen? Well, no, I don't know. I suppose it could, somebody could have made, I could be hallucinating, or somebody could have made a fake thing that just looks a lot like a pen, but it wouldn't actually write, doesn't, whatever. It's not actually a pen. Okay, I can doubt that. I could go through my belief. Well, what Descartes says is I can't really go through my beliefs one by one like that. That would take forever. And so he's not going to proceed in that way. Instead, he's going to come up with kind of general reasons for doubt. And he's going to try to find the strongest general reason for doubt. And in his view, he's going to find one that this kind of strongest general reason that he finds, and it calls into doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. It eliminates all of these dubitable beliefs from consideration. Now, before we get to those, though, before we get to these reasons for doubt that he gives us, I want to say something very quick about what he's trying to do, because students can get kind of hung up on this or confused by it or whatever, or think he's trying to do something that he's not. So I've been talking about how Descartes is going to try to call things into doubt, try to call a bunch of our beliefs into doubt. And again, what's the reasoning here? Well, if something can be doubted, it's not a good foundation for the sciences. We're going to call into doubt everything that can be doubted, and then whatever remains, who knows what it'll be, but whatever remains could serve as a foundation for the sciences going forward. Okay, fine, good, great, perfect. Now, initial clarification on what this doubting amounts to. He thinks, let's just take an example. What is the example I use? Okay, there's an example of a belief you might have. You believe that you're watching a video right now. Yeah, seems fair enough. Okay. He thinks that that's doubtable. And so a belief like that shouldn't serve as the foundation for science. Don't disregard the fact that it's why would that even be important for science at all? But whatever, a belief like that shouldn't serve as the foundation for science because it can be doubted. So what he's going to try to do is give us a reason for doubting that belief. Now, he is not trying to get you to believe this. He's not trying to get you in a mental state where you believe that you're not watching a video right now. That's not what Descartes is trying to do. He's trying to get you into a kind of middle state, an agnostic state. These reasons for doubt that Descartes gives us are supposed to get us into that middle state where you don't believe one way or the other, right? So there are three different kinds of attitudes you might take towards whether or not you're watching a video right now. You might think you are, which I assume most of you believe that. You might believe you are not. That would be kind of strange. Descartes is trying to get us not to be on either of those extremes, if you will, but to be in the middle, to not have your mind made up. I don't know if I'm watching a video right now. I don't believe I am. I don't believe I'm not. I have no idea. I don't take any stand one way or the other. That's where Descartes is trying to get us. And this point kind of generalizes, right? So this is just an example, right, of watching a video right now. You might believe something is true. You might believe it's not true. What Descartes is trying to get you to do is to be in that middle area with regard to everything that could possibly be doubted. He's trying to get you to be in that middle area. So he's going to think, for example, that whether or not you have a hand, right? You look at your hand. Do you have a hand? He thinks that's doubtable, that we could doubt that. You, I'm pretty sure, probably believe you have a hand. I believe I have a hand, right? He's not trying to get you to believe that you don't have a hand. That's not what Descartes is trying to do. He's trying to get you to withhold assent, to get to that middle place. Well, I don't know if I have a hand. I don't believe one way or the other. I don't believe I do have a hand. I don't believe I don't have a hand. I don't know what to make of it. That's what these skeptical these reasons for skepticism, for doubt, that Descartes is going to give us, which we're about to turn to, they're supposed to get us to this middle area where we don't believe one way or the other, right? Something like that. Okay. So what are these reasons for doubt? This is the material that Descartes goes through in the first meditation. So people refer to these as stages of doubt, or sometimes we'll talk about them as the skeptical hypotheses. There are three of these. There are, it depends on how you count, kind of, but according to most people's counting, there are three stages of doubt, or three skeptical hypotheses, right? Stages of doubt, skeptical hypotheses, same thing. And they get progressively stronger. So what these are they are reasons for doubting. And in particular, what Descartes is concerned with is our perception. Doubting perception. He wants to call into doubt everything that can be perceived. That's what he's kind of aiming at. And he's going to give us successively stronger reasons for doubting our perception. And by the end of it, once we get to this third one, he thinks he'll have found a stage of doubt, or a skeptical hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, that is sufficiently strong, that calls into doubt all perception, and it calls into doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, right? And so Descartes is going to be happy with that. But these earlier ones, the first two, he's not going to be happy with. He's going to think there's problems. They don't call enough into doubt. And recall, we want to call everything into doubt so that we can eliminate everything that could possibly be false. And so that the only thing that would be left would be things that are absolutely certain, undoubtedly true. Those are the things that we're going to build science off of. Okay. So, first stage of doubt. Descartes, on page 2 of the Meditations, notes that the senses sometimes deceive us. I think he gives an example of what, I don't know, there's a tower. He does this in the sixth meditation, now that I think about it, I think. But, there might be a tower really far away, a square, a kind of rectangular tower or whatever. But there is a fog and you're really far away. And so it might look to you like it's cylindrical. The senses are deceiving you. It looks cylindrical, but it's not, right? Something like that is Descartes' idea. And so that's a reason why we should doubt our senses. We should doubt perception, according to Descartes. But what he notes is that, well, really, this only gives you a reason to doubt perception in unfavorable conditions. So in the Meditations itself, there's a section of text on page 2 that kind of goes between doubtful and hopeful. And our translator has some note about that. That's the translator's, he put that in there. Descartes didn't have that in there. It's supposed to kind of signal when Descartes is saying, well, look, the senses sometimes deceive, but no, only under these unfavorable conditions. It's supposed to signal a kind of change in mood because Descartes is kind of talking to himself in this section of the text, and it's supposed to help signal that and help you keep things clear. Senses sometimes deceive us, right? You see the tower really far away, it looks round to you, but it's not, it's actually square. Don't believe your senses. Never believe anything your senses say. That's supposed to be, the reason for doubt. But then Descartes responds, well, that's not a very good reason for doubt because, well, yeah, when there's a fog and you're really far away, yeah, fine, don't believe your senses. But let's say there's not a fog and you're up close. The fact that your senses sometimes deceive you in these conditions, like when there's a fog and you're really far away, that doesn't give you any reason to doubt that when you're right up next to the tower, that you know the shape of it, right? And so this stage of doubt, or this reason for doubt, only raises doubts about perceptions in a very only about a very limited class of perceptions, namely those when you see something and it's really far away, or imagine there's a lot of noise and someone says something to you. You may not be able to pick it out, and yeah, did I hear him say that? I don't know if I right. But if there's no noise and you hear the person say something, right, you can be much. The fact that sometimes your ears don't give you fully accurate information when there are these unfavorable conditions, when there's lots and lots of noise, that doesn't give you any reason for doubting when there's no noise. It doesn't give you any reason for doubting what somebody said, that you heard it accurately. Here's another illustration of this idea, right? Descartes' example is, I don't know, it's a little lame, right? A tower far away. Here's a non-lame example. So take this image. Square A, square B, pretty clearly labeled there. Are those the same color? And most people's reaction is to say, well, no, clearly they're not the same color. Square A is darker. It's one of the darker squares. Square B is whatever, lighter. It's light gray. Square A is dark gray. Yeah, I assume that's what most people think. Not true. They are the same exact shade of gray. Your eyes were deceiving you. Your eyes were telling you that they were different shades of gray, that, well, I can't remember now, that what, B was lighter than A, I think. Let me do it one more time, why not? Not true, right? Your eyes right now, they're deceiving you. They're telling you B is lighter than A, but it's not. Same exact shade of gray. There's no trick there. Well, there is a trick, but those legitimately are the same shade of gray. That's the kind of thing that Descartes has in mind, right? And so optical illusions more generally would fall into this category, right? That's the kind of thing that Descartes has in mind when he's talking about how the senses sometimes deceive us. But that's not a really good reason for doubt. The fact that A and B look similar to you in that picture, right? And your eyes deceive you about that. Does that give you a reason for doubting that you have a hand? No. Right? When people have designed pictures that are meant to trick your eyes, well, yeah, okay, you can doubt your perceptions in that case. So you go back and you look at A and B, okay, I'm going to doubt that they're the same color now because this thing was deliberately designed to trick my eyes, right? Well, that's a pretty unfavorable condition for perception, right? And so, fine. Senses sometimes deceive us. The tower far away in the fog, or you have an optical illusion or something like that. But that fact really only gives you reason to doubt a very limited range of perceptions, namely perceptions in unfavorable conditions. And so that's not very strong. That doesn't call very many things into doubt. And so Descartes is not really happy with it. He wants something stronger. He wants to call everything into doubt that could possibly be doubted. This doesn't do it. And so he moves on to a stronger reason for skepticism, a stronger skeptical hypothesis. Second one, he calls the dream hypothesis. It's pretty simple. He says, well, maybe right now you're dreaming. Maybe it's a very, very lucid and vivid dream that you're having right now. Yeah. And so if that's true, when I look at my hand and I say, my hand is right there, there's my hand. That's wrong. It's not. My hand is whatever, down by my side or under my pillow or wherever it is, right? I'm actually sleeping. I'm dreaming. My hand is, I sleep like this. It's not right there. Yeah. And so when I think it is right there, this this hypothesis, right? Well, what if you're dreaming? This question, what if you're dreaming, gives you a reason to doubt that. Well, yeah, if I'm dreaming, my hand's not right there. It should. Oh, yeah, okay, so maybe it's not right there. That's a reason to. Well, geez, I don't know if my hand is there. I don't know. I mean, I thought it was. I always believed it was, but now you raise this. Well, maybe you're dreaming. I don't know if it is. So this dream hypothesis has been has seeped its way into popular culture to varying degrees. You find this kind of idea in a lot of movies. If any of you have seen The Matrix, there's actually a lot written about the Matrix and Descartes and the dream hypothesis in particular. But in the Matrix, in that movie, you have, I don't know, something like this going on. It's not so much a dream; it's evil robots messing with your brain, or I don't know, whatever. You can go watch a movie. More recently, there's what is that movie with what's his face, the Titanic guy, Leonardo DiCaprio? Yeah, Inception. Right, there's all this stuff, you're in a dream and you don't know if you're awake, and if you're in a dream, and so is that thing real, and whatever, things like that, right? That's the idea, something like that. What is reality? How do you know this is real? That's kind of the what Descartes is getting at here. All right, so this is a much, much stronger skeptical hypothesis. This is a much, much stronger reason for doubt. If you are actually dreaming, well, yeah, then anything that you're experiencing right now wouldn't be true. You're watching a video right now? No, you're not. You are in bed, right? The dream hypothesis would give you a reason for doubting that you are watching a video right now. To pick up on what I was saying earlier, Descartes not trying to convince you that you are not watching a video right now. He's trying to get you to that middle state, right? The dream hypothesis is supposed to get you to that middle state with regard to whether or not you're watching a video right now. I don't know. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. I have no idea, right? Something like that. And if you were to reply, well, I don't know. None of my dreams ever when I'm dreaming, I know that I'm dreaming or whatever, and whatever. I have, lucid dreams I can control or something. Okay, yeah, maybe sometimes that happens, but sometimes when you're dreaming, that doesn't happen. You are absolutely convinced that what's happening is real. You are, and you're terrified or whatever, or you're elated or whatever. I suppose it depends what happened in your dream. But you think the things that are happening are real. Yeah. And so maybe there's a dream like that. It's it's not a lucid dream. You don't know that you're dreaming. You really think that this one's real. Yeah. But then somebody might say, well, I don't know. I've never had a dream like this, right? I mean, this isn't I'm not dreaming right now because this is part of this has been going on forever. This is part of my continuous life. I've got all this stuff that's happened in the past that this is continuous with. Dreams aren't like that. When I dream, and even if it's a really vivid dream, it usually just begins from afresh. It doesn't pick up where my previous dream left off or anything like that. Whereas what's going on right now, this picked up from where I left off last night. I went to sleep last night and then I woke up in this morning and my life picked up as it was yesterday, right? And so there's a kind of continuity to this experience that you don't find in dreams. And so somebody might say, well, look, isn't that a reason to think we're not dreaming right now? Yeah. And so we don't need to worry about this. Descartes would say, well, maybe this is the first time you've had one of these really vivid, continuous dreams. Maybe this is the first dream you've had like this. I don't know. How can you show me definitively that it's not, right? Descartes is not arguing that we are actually dreaming. And so he's saying, I don't know, maybe you are. And until you can definitively show me that you're not, well, this is going to be a reason for doubting anything that you actually perceive. And he doesn't really think you're going to be able to give him a definitive reason for thinking that you're not dreaming, right? We already went through the reasons you might give. Well, this is really vivid. Sometimes dreams are. This is continuous. Maybe this is the first continuous dream you've had, right? So that's the dream hypothesis. Very strong. It would call into doubt all perception, or not quite all, almost all perceptions. It certainly calls into doubt perception even under favorable conditions, right? So it's stronger than the first one. You're standing next to the tower. Yeah. I know that it's whatever, a square. There's no fog. Favorable conditions. Well, if you're dreaming, there's no tower actually there. There's no square tower actually right there, right? And so the dream hypothesis would call into doubt those perceptions as well, even when there's no fog or optical illusion or whatever it might be. All right, so that's a much stronger skeptical hypothesis, a much stronger reason for doubt, right? It casts doubt on a much larger class of perceptions. But as I already said previously, right, there are 3 of these stages of doubt or skeptical hypotheses, and we've only gotten through 2. So there's going to be something insufficient about this. What's the problem here? Descartes, this is kind of tricky. Descartes thinks the dream hypothesis is insufficient. It doesn't call into doubt everything that could be called into doubt. There are things that are doubtable that the dream hypothesis does not call into doubt. And his explanation of this is a bit tricky. It's kind of difficult to understand, but here we go. His idea is something like the following. Let's say you are dreaming right now. Well, then what's happening is your mind is making all this stuff up, right? You're looking at your hand. Your mind is making up that, making up the hand that you're seeing. It's not actually there. Your mind's just making it up. Well, in order for your mind to make up, to create your dreams, it has to have certain materials that it works with, certain building blocks from which it can build your dreams. Yeah. And so take just your hand, right? You're looking at your hand. Your mind, let's say you're dreaming, and so your mind's creating that for you. Well, your mind is providing a certain kind of shape to the thing, a certain color, whatever, and so on, a certain quantity, extension, right? That it kind of takes up space, or looks like it takes up space. That's what he means by extension. And so your mind is making use of these materials or building blocks, and then, right, so it has the color, I don't know what you call that color, whatever that color is, right? It takes that color and it takes the hand shape and it mashes them together and produces this image for me, for my mind. And that's where this thing is coming from. My mind's creating it. Well, in order for my mind to do that, it has to be stocked with those building blocks. It has to have that color in its whatever stock of materials. It has to have that building block. It has to have that shape. Something like that is Descartes' idea. Well, okay. And so what Descartes wants to say is that the dream hypothesis, so what's the problem? Okay, fine, your mind has to be stocked with these things, but so what? The problem, according to Descartes, is that the dream hypothesis doesn't call into doubt that we ever perceived these things. Indeed, it seems to require that at some point in the past, we actually perceived hand shape or that particular color. Right? If your mind is supplied with this color and that shape, well, the dream hypothesis would seem to require that at some point in the past, you actually perceived that color and that shape. And that's how the idea got in your mind. And so now when you're sleeping, your mind can put it all together and make up a hand for you or whatever it might be. So it doesn't call into doubt. The dream hypothesis does not call into doubt our having perceived in the past these building blocks, colors, shapes, sizes, number, quantity. These are some of the things that Descartes mentions, right? So that's a very kind of limited class of perception. So the idea would be something like, right, at some point in the past, you had to actually perceive that color. That color exists out there in the world, and you perceived it. You supplied your mind with it, and now you're dreaming and you're making up stuff or whatever, right? The dream hypothesis doesn't call into doubt all perception. It leaves this very limited class of perceptions undoubted, right? That you perceived colors, that you perceived shapes, and stocked your mind with these ideas by perceiving them. And so the dream hypothesis is going to be insufficient as well, because Descartes thinks we can call into doubt all perception. The dream hypothesis does not do that. Okay. So he moves on to something even stronger, what people call the deceiving God hypothesis. And the basic idea here, Descartes says, well, imagine, I've got this idea in my mind of an all-powerful being, God, right? Who knows whether God exists or whatever? We haven't gotten there yet. Who knows? But I have this idea at the very least, yeah? Well, imagine that all-powerful being were like evil and was determined to deceive me about everything that I could possibly be deceived about. What if there were a deceiving God, a deceiving all-powerful being who at every turn tried to deceive me about everything, right? And this being is all-powerful. Well, that's certainly going to call into doubt, when you see the tower through the fog, is the tower actually that? Well, the deceiving God could just mess with your mind and make you think it's one shape when it's not, right? Okay, fine. So it covers all the stuff that the first hypothesis covers. It also covers all the stuff that the second one does, right? If there's a deceiving God and you're looking at your hand, well, yeah, you're not actually looking at a hand. That's just the deceiving God putting that idea into your mind. There's no hand there, actually. You might not even have a body, right? Your perception of your body, that's just the deceiving God deceiving you, perhaps, right? Making you think you do. And so you look down and you see it and you kind of feel, but no, you don't actually have a body. All those perceptions in your mind, all those things that you feel or sense in your mind, right? That's just the deceiving God messing with you. Well, what about these building blocks? Descartes' idea is that the deceiving God hypothesis calls into doubt that you ever perceived these building blocks as well. Because again, the idea would be, it's not that these things are real or out there in the world. It's not that you ever had to furnish your mind with them by actually perceiving them in the world, these building blocks. No. The deceiving God is just deceiving you about all this stuff, is maybe supplying your mind himself with these ideas, even though they don't track anything in reality. Right? And so Descartes' idea is that this hypothesis is going to call into doubt all perception across the board. Every last thing or bit of information that could have possibly come into your mind through your senses, through perception, the deceiving God hypothesis calls into doubt. But what he then goes on to note is that it calls into doubt even more than just perception. It calls into doubt even things that we think of as most certain, like mathematical truths. So, for example, you're sitting there thinking, think of something like 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that seems absolutely certain. There's no way that could be false. 2 + 2 = 4. The deceiving God hypothesis even calls that into doubt. Does 2 + 2 = 4? Maybe when I think 2 + 2 = 4, what's actually going on is the deceiving God is deceiving me. Maybe 2 + 2 actually equals 5, but when I think 2 + 2, the deceiving God comes in and messes with my mind and makes me think that it's 4. Even though it doesn't. And he implants this feeling of absolute certainty in me. I'm certain that 2 + 2 = 4. Maybe that's just the deceiving God putting that feeling in me, making me think that, 2 + 2 = 4, when in fact, in truth, it doesn't. 2 + 2 = 5, right? Right? This is an omnipotent being. It's very hard to imagine how 2 + 2 = 5, but maybe that's just how evil and deceiving and powerful this being is, right? Maybe it does actually equal 5, but this deceiving God is so good and so powerful and so deceptive that I, for the world, can't see how 2 plus 2 could possibly equal 5, right? That's just how deceived I am. Now, that's the deceiving God hypothesis. According to Descartes, that calls into doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. Yeah. Anything that could be doubted is going to be called into doubt by that deceiving God hypothesis. Recall what he's doing. Why is he going through these skeptical hypotheses? Why is he doing this? He's trying to call into doubt everything that can possibly be doubted. The deceiving God hypothesis does that. Why is he trying to call into doubt everything that could be doubted? Because we're trying to find certain indubitable foundations for knowledge. It's only beliefs that can survive these skeptical hypotheses, only beliefs that survive them are certain and indubitable, undoubtable, right? And so the deceiving God hypothesis is really what Descartes is going to use for the remainder of the meditations. The first two hypotheses, since they are insufficient, he's going to kind of abandon, right? And it's really the deceiving God hypothesis that he's going to focus on. The deceiving God hypothesis calls into doubt everything that can be doubted. And so if there is something that the deceiving God hypothesis does not call into doubt, well, then that thing is certain and indubitable. That thing, that belief, whatever it might be, who knows what it is at this point, if there is even such a thing, that belief could serve as a foundation for human knowledge. That's Descartes' idea. That's what he's trying to do, so that we can establish the new science on sure, stable, lasting foundations. So the deceiving God hypothesis in particular, but really kind of all the skeptical hypotheses, but the deceiving God hypothesis in particular, that's like the demolition crew. That's getting rid of everything that we might believe that's doubtable, right? That was one of the things Descartes had announced at the beginning of the meditations that he's going to do. We're going to demolish everything. That's what the deceiving God hypothesis does. Now, starting in the second meditation, he's going to start trying to build back up. So as you read the second meditation, try to pay attention to how exactly he does that. What belief does Descartes claim to find? And he does claim to find one. What belief escapes this reason for doubt? He thinks there's a belief out there that the deceiving God hypothesis doesn't cause you to doubt. It causes you to doubt just about everything except at least this one belief, according to Descartes. Pay attention to how that works. All right.